All right, I think that's all the announcements. Let's move on to our study. Now, we've been studying the life of Christ. We're doing a study of a chronological study of the life of Christ. And what that means is we take all four gospel accounts and you look at the various events in the life of Christ and you put those in a number, and then you go to the different gospel account that talks about that. And sometimes, if you would go to the next slide for me, sometimes, as you see in this slide, it's only in one account. We've been in the book of John now for several weeks because all these various events that only John tells us about. Well, today, as you can see there, that last one on the bottom, where Jesus comes to Gethsemane. That's where we're at now in John chapter 18, verse 1. But you'll notice on there that all four accounts talk about this particular point. And then I don't have a slide that's going to take you to the next one. But if you want to go to our website and go to where it says media and then Bible study resources, this list is on there and it'll show you the next several things that we're going to study. And that is, we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, and from this point on, we're going to enter into Friday of the last week of the life of Christ. Because whenever they come to arrest him, that puts things in motion for the trials and then the scourgings and everything that happens all that Friday leading up even to his crucifixion and then his burial. And then, of course, Saturday and then Sunday, him rising from the grave. And so what's happening in this, we've been making plans now for a few months to wrap up this study this month, because next month I'm going to start teaching the book of Ezekiel. We have been studying the life of Christ for a little over 3.5 years. And so we've done well to get all the way up to the last day, couple of days of the Passion of Christ. Now, we're going to do this, and then next Sunday we'll continue this study, but then after that we're obviously not going to have enough time to get into all of the things that we could study about the crucifixion and things like that. But I feel like that is a portion that most Christians know pretty well. It's all the things leading up to it that maybe we don't study as much, and why we've taken our time verse by verse studying this chronology of Christ. So we are going to end this study this month, coming up a little bit short of studying the crucifixion. But that's something I would encourage you, now that we've done all this study, for you to go read on your own, following that chronology, that harmony of the gospel accounts, and reading all four about what happened in regards to his death, burial, and resurrection, because they're all incredible. Okay, so that being said, in John chapter 18, verse 1, it says, when Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. Okay, so, and Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, where Jesus often met there with his disciples, verse 1 and 2. This is an important point, because as I've been saying for the last several weeks, I've been calling John chapters, basically the last half of 13, all the way up until now, the consolation in the Kidron Valley. Some people call it the Upper Room Discourse, and we've already talked about that a lot and what that means, and this is one of the reasons why I call it that, because they cross over the brook Kidron. Right there is this, they're walking, and then the important point is they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is, as I mentioned, starting to get into those elements that most Christians understand quite well. They understand all the sequence of what happened with Jesus in his final hours on the earth. And so this is where he enters into the garden after he's already consoled his disciples. And that's an important point, because remember, I painted the picture for the last several weeks of these disciples being confused and perplexed and trying to understand all this, and they've just had a big meal, and now they're walking through the night, and they're trying to put all this stuff together, and Jesus is teaching all these deep, profound truths, and even praying for them and saying he's going away, and you see all that confusion and everything that takes place. Now, I don't know how many of you have been in stressful situations. I would assume that most of us have been, where We've been in an extremely stressful situation. And whenever that stressful situation goes for a considerable amount of time, for let's say hours or a while, what typically happens once you finally get to the point where you can just stop and breathe and just kind of relax for a second, what happens? Right? A lot of times we just, I need to go to sleep. We go to sleep. Our bodies have absorbed so much adrenaline and everything else that it wears us out, and we need to sleep. So that's kind of where we're going with this. So John, as we're here in John chapter 18, if you're just reading John, man, there's no rest for the weary period. You don't see anything, but instead what you see is spoken these words. He enters into the Garden of Gethsemane, for this is where Jesus often met there with his disciples. And then verse 3, then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. So if you're just reading John's account and you think, man, they just arrived there and then here comes Judas. Well, in one sense, that is what happens. But again, most people know this story pretty well. They know, well, wait a minute. Isn't there that part that talks about Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane? And indeed there is. And that's why we do this chronological study. Because we've been tracking in John all those events that only John tells us about. But then John skips over, for some reason, this part of the prayer. All right? Each inspired writer has their reasons and purposes that are given to them from inspiration. But fortunately, we have, and again, while we study this, we have three other accounts. We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who do talk about what happens between verses 2 and 3 of John. And it's quite a bit. So turn with me to Matthew. Matthew chapter 26, verse 36. Okay? That means hurry. Do it quick. Matthew 26, 36. Hurry up, y'all. All right. All right. Yeah. Come quickly, Lord Jesus. Come. All right. Let's begin reading in verse 36. This is where we're going to pick up, like I said, in between verses 2 and 3 of John. This is what takes place. Let me back up just to verse 30, where he says, they went out and sung a hymn. They went out to the Mount of Olives. And then you have verse 31 through 35. You have where Peter denies him. And then, verse 36, then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane and said to the disciples, sit here while I go and pray over there. So here it is. Here's verse 1 and 2. Jesus crosses over the brook Kidron and comes to the Garden of Gethsemane. And John lets us know this is a place that he goes often to. Now, an interesting thing, the word geth is the Greek word for oil press. Many of you like olive oil, and that's how we get it, by pressing those olives. And so that's what geth means. And the word semene means olive orchard. And so there was an olive press within olive orchard. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today, and Lord willing, I'm going to get to go to Jerusalem one day. I don't know what my chances are. It seems like first it was COVID, and now, God bless him. By the way, John Moore, the one who's coordinating that trip and has done Searching for Truth, who we were supposed to go with last year and was planning to go with this year, he had that cardiac arrest. There's some electrical issue with his heart. He's now awake and speaking and talking with his children and all. And so he's doing a lot better, but I don't see a trip to Jerusalem in his near future. And so, he's got a lot of recovery. We'll see. But if you go to Jerusalem and you go up, and I learned this from John, who's been there, you go up to the area, there's a spot there on Mount of Olives, okay, that they say this is where Jesus prayed. This is the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus prayed. And it may well be. All right. If you go to Israel, they've got every spot marked of every little thing that happened. This is the spot where Mary came and visited Elizabeth and Jesus wept in her womb. This is the spot where this happened. This is the spot. And they built a church in a lot of those places. They've built like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and things like that right on the very spot. Now the interesting thing, those spots, many of those spots were determined several hundred years later by, we get her name, I can't remember her name, but it is Constantine, Emperor Constantine, his mother, all right, went over there and pointed out and said, this is where this happened, this is where that happened, and things like that. Well, she's not an archaeologist. She doesn't know all these things. She might have had a good guess, but don't know that for a fact. Bring all this up because in that spot where they say this is where Jesus prayed, well, tradition shows that there hasn't been an olive orchard there. And actually there still is an olive orchard a little further down on the side of the hill, and archaeology has found lots of those old millstones, those presses, those olive presses and things like that. And so it looks like another area is more likely to be where Jesus prayed. It's the same thing with Golgotha, the place where Jesus was crucified. They think they've identified that. Well, there's a lot of people that say, no, that's not it. If you really look at and study it, it's really this place over here, and it's on the backside of a bus parking lot. And so it just shows how tradition versus what we really know, well, we don't really know. Yeah. I believe so. Yes. That's all. Jerusalem is divided up between the Jews, the Palestinians, and the Muslims. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's divided up in 3 different sections. All right. So that's just one little thing. Let's get on with it's interesting, the archaeology behind it. And he took with him Peter, the 2 sons of Zebedee. Who are the 2 sons of Zebedee? James and John. So he took with him Peter, James, and John, and began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. All right, his soul is grieved, at the point of death. And he says, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, Oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. And in verse 40, then he came to the disciples and found them asleep. That's why I was saying a minute ago, after all this stress that they've been through and trying to figure things out, plus they've had a big meal, and it's late at night, obviously, or we speculate around midnight or really close to it. No wonder they're tired and they fall asleep. And he came to the disciples, found them asleep, and said, What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away again a second time and prayed, saying, Oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, here he who betrays me is at hand. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. All right. So verse 36 lines up with verse 1 and 2 of John, and verse 47 lines up with verse 3 of John. So you see there's a whole lot of other things that happened in between those 2 verses in John, and that is he went and prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane. We know exactly where he went, and he prayed how many times? 3 times. All right, so let's look at this and see what we can learn. So first and foremost, he says he goes and he prays, and it says his soul is sorrowful. Luke chapter 22 gives a little bit more information about this than what Matthew and Mark do. So let's go to Luke chapter 22, verse 41. And this is Luke's inspired version of this. And he says in verse 41, and he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood, falling down to the ground. And when he rose up from prayer, he had come to his disciples. He found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, why do you sleep? Rise and pray, lest you enter into temptation. And then, verse 47, while he was speaking, the multitude comes. So Luke, let me back up. So John skips over this. Matthew gives us a lot more information, shows us where he was and what he did and what was happening. And then Luke gives us even more insight or deeper information, some details about that. So that's what we're going to look at. Now, there is so much profound implications here to learn in just this little section of Jesus praying in the garden. But we need to be careful, because sometimes what winds up happening is we wind up speculating a lot more than we should. And when I say that is because when you read commentaries, and there's nothing wrong with commentaries, but as many teachers have stood in this podium and pulpit and have said, the first thing you need to do is not read a commentary. The first thing you need to do is read the Bible and read the various accounts. And a lot of times you can, if you've been studying your Bible long enough, you will start to figure these things out without even needing to pick up a commentary. Now, that's not to say that commentaries aren't useful and that I get a lot of information. In fact, what I have in my hand is commentary. I just don't agree with all the commentary that is in my hand right here, because what winds up happening is all commentaries are men's opinions. And all we have is opinion when it comes to what Jesus was actually thinking or feeling when he was praying. And so I start this section right here by saying, all we can know is just conjecture or opinion. We need to look at the scriptures of what it actually says. Now, what it actually says, it says, he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. All right, there's no way of knowing, like I said, exactly what is going on in Jesus' heart or mind. But here we do see a couple of different really deep implications. Number one, we do see Jesus' humanity. Okay? The fact that his soul, that he's distressed and that he's sorrowful, those are human emotions. Okay? And so we see his humanity come out. And we also know that the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus, being like us, was what? He was tempted in all points as we are, right? Jesus is 100% man. He's 100% God, even in this moment right here. And that means that he still is susceptible to what? Temptation, right? So there's some sorrow and distress as well, because quite frankly, if you think about it, this is Satan's last chance, right? This is Satan's last chance. And so if he can get one, he's got a couple of different options here he can work with. One, if he can just get Jesus to sin, then he's in good shape, right? And God's plan can't go through. Or, two, if he can get Jesus to refuse to go to the cross. You see that? There's Satan's got a couple of game plans or war plans here, if you will, in this last stand. So there is that side, his humanity. But then there's also his divinity, because notice what Jesus says. He says in verse 39, what does he call God, y'all? What does your Bible say? What does he call God? He says, oh, what? Right, but what does he say? My Father. Have you ever noticed that? Many times when he's teaching his disciples, what does he say? Our Father. Your Father, right? Our Father, your Father. Here he says, oh, my Father. And the fact that he fully understands everything, the fact that he says, for example, the hour has come, my betrayer is at hand. Can you imagine having a bird's eye view of everything that's going on leading up to your execution and all that's going on? In other words, here you are in this little place, this Garden of Gethsemane, praying, but you have the qualities of deity to be able to know what's taking place in somewhere else. Friends and brethren, that's God. What is God? God is omnipotent, omniscient, right, and omnipresent. Now we see this omnipotency in here whenever he says, he rebukes, we'll read that in a little bit, when he rebukes Peter and says, put away your sword. You know, I could call 12 legions of angels, right? There's his omnipotency, right? He's omnipotent. His omnipresence is seen right here in the fact that he knows what's going on, that the hour is at hand. His betrayer is coming. He knows, he stands up and goes, okay, the hour's here. Here he comes. All right, so there's that. He knows what's going on there. And then there's also his omniscience in the fact that he knows God's overall plan. And that's why he comes with this plea of the cup. Now, let me throw this in there real quick. The cup, when he's talking about his cup, if you look in, where's my verse that I have? Yes, go back with me to Matthew. We're here in Matthew chapter 20. Remember in chapter 20, speaking of the sons of thunder and the sons of Zebedee, you remember they came to him, and in chapter 20, verse 21, they had asked him if they could sit on his right hand and left hand, and notice what Jesus says. You do not know what you ask. Are you able to drink the what? Cup that I am about to drink. All right, and be baptized with the baptism I'm about to be baptized with. Now, baptism, it's interesting he uses that word right there, because what is baptism? Baptism is immersion, right? Not sprinkled, not poured. He's about to be immersed into an incredible situation. He calls it the cup. Does that help add to the understanding a little bit? Going now back, whenever he asked the Lord, is it possible to let this cup pass from me? Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. When you think of cup, now here's where I say that we get into trouble, and I want to open up to discussion because I know there's lots of different ideas and opinions on this. We get into cup. A lot of commentaries and a lot of preachers will say, you know, that sweat drops of blood and that worry, that's his humanity on display. He knew he was going to suffer. He knew the pain that was coming. He knew how it was going to feel. He knew what it was going to be. Yes. That's just one aspect of it. Remember, I said he's 100% human. He's 100% deity. And so from the human side, yes, he is worried about that pain and everything else. But you're forgetting one important thing. What does Luke 19:10 say? Jesus was very specific about why he came to earth. To seek and save the lost, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He knew it. He gave up heaven to come do that. So it's not like he didn't know what was coming. So, yeah, there is the pain, but I submit to you that's not the main reason he was sweating great sweat drops of blood, and his soul was distressed, and he was sorrowful. Now, what would make a person sorrowful? Why would Jesus be sorry to go to the cross? You with me? What would make Jesus sorrowful? Lord, is he standing there saying, I don't deserve this punishment? Why? No, that's usually why we would be sorry, right? So what would make Jesus sorrowful?
Could he be sorrowful that he couldn't do more?
Ooh, Joey, that's very deep. Could he be sorrowful that he couldn't do more? All right?
Most of his relatives and all of his people, the people of God, in 1,500 years, most of them are about to be separated from
Y'all hear what he said?
Comes from is human, that God says separate these people. This is the end of the Jewish economy. He knows that. So, as you well know, I know the opinion that was the concern Jesus had.
Well, I'm with you there, Jack. So the concern, Jack, if you didn't hear, those of you online as well didn't hear, Jack was saying that this is about to be the end of the Jewish economy. There's about to be, his own people are about to be lost. Now, before you get up in arms about that, keep your finger right here and go with me to Genesis chapter 6. Remember, I told you that Jesus is God. He's 100% deity. And so if he is God on earth, then we can get a glimpse into what God feels, and we can get a glimpse into Jesus' heart. All right, if you go to Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6, I want you to read this with me. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was, what? Sorry. The Lord was sorrowful that he, if I can put that word in there, that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Ooh, isn't that interesting? Jesus describes himself as being grieved in his soul and sorrowful. And right here in Genesis, we see whenever God is about to destroy the earth, that it grieved him. He was sorrowful. All right, and then if you could continue on that in chapter 9, Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 through 15, you see that this is after the flood and everything, and this is that famous, I say famous, a well-known verse where he makes the covenant with Noah. And what does he tell Noah? I will never destroy man with water, that's key, with water on the face of the earth again. All right? Now, I want to add 2 more verses in here. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 3 and 4 says that God desires that all come to the knowledge of the truth, and that none, all right? Now let me add to that, 2 Peter 3, verse 9, and that none should perish. If you take those two and put them together. He wants everyone to be saved and know the knowledge of truth. He wants none to perish. So God created us, me and you, his creation. He doesn't want to lose us. He doesn't want us, he wants us to be with him. He wants his creation to be with him. And so it grieves him to his soul. It makes him sorrowful when man is intent on evil and practices evil all the time and is separated from him. That, I believe, and I think Jack would agree with me on this, that's why Jesus is sorrowful. That's why he's grieved to his soul, because he knows that from this point forward, Jack mentioned 1,500 years. I'd add 4,000 years. All right, if the earth is 6,000 years old, and we've been here 2,000 since Jesus, so for 4,000 years, God has been coming to this point right here. And now it grieves into his soul that he's done all this work and all this to get mankind reconciled back to him, and yet it's already been proven. There's people who want to kill his son. It's already been proven that there's going to be a whole nation that's going to reject his son. It's already been proven that man, for the next 2020, still reject Jesus Christ, his son. Would that grieve your soul? So that's why I say we got to be careful with commentaries. We got to be careful with things, because I do agree with them. Jesus is grieving and he's not looking forward to being on the cross. But I feel like that's a very narrow look at it. You're looking at it with human eyes. You need to back up and look at it with God's eyes and say, why is he so distraught? Why is he asking him? Now, again, Satan's there to tempt him. If he can get him to sin, if he can get him to refuse the cross, then he's won. Jesus came to do that, and he understands that. That's part of it. He's also asking is for strength. Help me with this. And his attitude is what our attitude should be in all things. Father, it doesn't matter what I want. What you want is what I'm going to do. And 3 times Jesus went to God and said, God, if it's possible, can we do something else? Is it possible to do something else? Now, if he's God on the flesh, he knows it's not possible to do something else, that this is the plan. But is this really it? Am I off here by saying that? 3 times, God says no. What's the lesson for us? If God will say, I think that's the lesson here. It's more of a lesson for us than it is him questioning God if there's another way. The lesson is, if God will not change his mind or will say no to his only Son, what does that say to us? God's not going to change his mind, and he's going to say no to us just as much as he would say to his Son. Now, that doesn't mean God will never answer our prayers, because God answered Jesus' prayers. He'll answer our prayers. But sometimes his answer is no, N-O. Make sense? So, again, looking at it, did you have a comment? Yes, go ahead.
I would say we don't necessarily know that God's answer to Jesus was no.
Right, that's true.
Because if the answer is, Jesus, it's up to you, what kind of, that changes your perspective a little bit.
That's a great point, Joe.
I think that Jesus did go, I mean, when he says, I can call 12 legions of angels, I think that that's true. I think that he had the ability to pray to the Father, call 12 legions of angels, and basically wipe out the world's population 2 times over easily. And yet he left it up to Jesus, and Jesus voluntarily went to that cross for us, as opposed to not having a choice to do it.
And he had to do it voluntarily. That's the other part of the equation. That's why I started out by saying there's so many profound implications in this. We really got to think this through and think about it. And I never thought about that before, Joe. That's a great point. What if it wasn't God saying no, but, Jesus, it's up to you. You need to make the decision. All right. Again, I do believe that this is here to teach us that God, will say no to his Son just like he say no to us. But then again, we voluntarily, just like Jesus, need to submit to God. And that's the other part of not as I will, but as I will. So I'm volunteering. Does that coincide with what you're saying?
There's another hint about this volunteering in verse 2.
Talk to me.
Do you see it?
Verse 2 of?
John.
Okay.
Now Judas also, when he prayed him, knew the place. Why would Jesus go to a place that was well known to Judas?
Wow. Why would Jesus go to a place that was well known to Judas?
If I would go hide someplace, we did. You see, this is all in the plan. So there's a lot more to it. And there's little hints in the Bible that just look at.
Going back to what we were saying earlier about read the Bible before you read commentaries and stuff, because as Jack just said, there's little hints, like right there in verse 2. Another great point I hadn't considered. There's just so much here, and what God wants is more important than what we want, and we need to be careful of, yes. Oh. Wow. He saw all outcomes. So a minute ago I was talking about his omnipresence and omniscience and everything else, the deity that he has. Well, that's the other thing. And in my mind, when you said that, Bliss, makes me think of, Sherlock Holmes and all those who look at all the different outcomes and everything. Could you imagine having that kind, Jesus, a human on earth with deity, being able to see all outcomes? Well, if I don't go to the cross, this will happen. If I do, this will happen. If I don't do this, if I don't go to the Garden of Gethsemane, this will happen. Wow, wow. Well, it sounds like I've explained it well. Then whenever we talk about him praying in the garden, there's a lot more going on there than just him praying for himself. All right. Why did Jesus come? He didn't come for himself. Listen, if there's some place to go, earth was not the place to come to leave heaven. And so he didn't come here for himself. He says that. I came to serve, not to be served. And so when he's praying in the garden, we need to remember those verses. Yes, there may be an element of him praying for himself, but it's a small element. If Paul could say this, our light afflictions, a man who'd been beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and everything else, calling all of that, listen, man, I've got a little scratch on my hand right here. It's driving me nuts right now. You know, and I'm thinking, he calls all that light afflictions for the great reward. If Paul, a 100% human, can say that, Jesus certainly knows what's ahead. In fact, there's a super important verse that we need to read. Go with me to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12, because there's a word in there that blew my mind this morning when I was reading that, and I went, wow, boy, if that doesn't have the overall view of Jesus' heart in Gethsemane, I don't know what else does. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by such a great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Now listen, here's the word that blew my mind. Who for the joy was set before him endured the cross. What? Now, when you take that verse and apply it to the Garden of Gethsemane, does that change your mind a little bit? For the joy that was set before him to endure the cross. Jesus considered it joy, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of God, right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, who was sinless, by the way, lest you become weary and discouraged in your own souls. Jesus was discouraged. He was worried in his, or he was, what does it say? He began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. He says, exceedingly sorrowful even unto death in his soul. But he could see the joy on the other side of that.
If Jesus refused to go to the cross, wouldn't the Lord still find a way to do whatever he needed to be done? The Lord would.
Oh yeah, the Lord's going to find a way, but Jesus had to submit. That's what was being said. Now, one more thing before we run out of time here. Verse 40, then he came to the disciples and found them asleep and said, what? Could you not watch with me one, what does he say? 1 hour. All right. He didn't say, could you not watch for a few minutes? You know, we read these verses, it's just a few minutes. I mean, we can read these verses in just a few seconds, right? It doesn't take very long to pray that. What does that tell us? Could you not watch for an hour? And then he goes and does it again. That means Jesus, it wasn't just these few words. He's sitting there agonizing and praying and praying. It was an extended amount of time that he's praying. Think about that in your prayer life whenever you go pray. I think about that often. Sometimes I'll sit there and pray for a while, and I go, that was a short, I need to pray more. I need a longer prayer. Because I read about these prayers in the Bible of people praying, and that's what Jesus was doing right there. And that sweat drops of blood coming from a physician. By the way, did you know that that's been proven to happen? You can actually do that. You can become so distressed that your blood starts to seep through your pores in sweat. That's distressed. But I think now, I hope I helped you see that distress was more than his own personal affliction he was worried about. All right, folks. We're going to take a short break and prepare for our worship service. I hope this has helped you understand this portion of the Scripture a little more. And next week, we're going to wrap up this study of the life of Christ.